Folks, thank you for being here. I'm Samal Naseem, I'm an assistant professor of economics at Colby College, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion on disparities in Pakistan's climate crisis. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words on the context. Economists often think about floods in terms of sort of the value lost of infrastructure. And so you can think about damaged roads and homes and crops, and of course, a loss in labor and labor productivity. But climate disasters themselves don't necessarily affect everyone equally, right? So these disasters expose and amplify a lot of the inequalities that already exist. Case in point is Pakistan's 2022 flood, which affected about 33 million people across the country and led to more than $30 billion in total economic losses and damages. Millions lost livelihoods, and then many were pushed back into poverty. But women often bear an even heavier burden when it comes to these sort of crises, through things like greater caregiving, more responsibilities, through reduced access to health and safety, and then loss in livelihoods and an increase in violence. So today's discussion isn't simply about climate change. It's about understanding the disproportionate impact of the problem. So who bears its costs, why those costs are unequal, and what is it that we can do to change that? And so we have a great panel here to talk about this. We have Sara Hayat. Sara is a lawyer and climate policy expert working at the intersection of climate justice, gender, and environmental law. We have Dr. Fazila Nabil. She's a climate and water governance expert whose work focuses on climate resilience, water security, and nature-based solutions. And then we have Dr. Zainab Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed is a deputy director of the BNU Center for Policy Research, where her work focuses on water governance, public policy, and political institutions. So let's start off with kind of understanding the challenge, and Sara, I'll begin with you. So what is the big picture? Take us through the fundamentals. When we say climate change affects women differently than men, what does that actually mean in practice, and how are women disproportionately affected during such crises?
Thank you, Saval. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. I've been to CDPR a couple of times before and always leave feeling much more enriched and happier. So a great panel. I hope you guys will learn something, even 2-3 things from this, because gender is something that is climate and gender is something very close to my heart. Like Saval said, I'm going to cut to the chase. So and lay a background sort of picture for you guys. I'd like to narrate it more like a story, so maybe it has a bigger impact. Just don't fall asleep. The climate impacts women more than men. It impacts women more inequitably than men. This is not a theoretical thing. This is not just dialogue. There's research proving it. There's stats proving it. There's enough jurisprudence now for it. We have cases in big courts that are dealing with it, laws to back this. But what needs to be understood is, first and foremost, the idea is not to paint women as a weaker gender in this narrative. The idea is, as Saval said, that women are disproportionately affected. They are the first who are affected, and they are the last who are affected, and they're affected the longest. And climate change acts as a threat multiplier for women when their existing lives become pretty much tougher or worse. So think about it like this. For most of rural parts of Sindh, southern Punjab, large areas of Balochistan, much less data, unfortunately, from there. Same for Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Think of a village, think of multiple houses. Some are concrete, some are mud. There's a community living, everybody's waking up, everybody knows each other, they're sharing communal resources. There is, by and large, a happy atmosphere. But a woman is waking up in the morning, she's doing excessive domestic labor. So she's the one responsible culturally, and I think this is actually true for most parts of the world. So it's not like a Pakistan specific thing, but she's collecting water, she is collecting firewood, she's cooking food, she's looking after the elders, she's looking after in-laws, her family, her children. She's just responsible for running the entire ecosystem of that house. With climate change, what's happening is this is becoming tougher. It's becoming harder. The UN has coined a term. They're calling it time burden. So what's happening is that there are some statistics that are saying, let's say, when water collection is concerned. So every village that you're thinking of does not, or every community doesn't have a water source. It doesn't have a well, it doesn't have a water pump. Some women are trudging about 2 kilometers daily, and they're saying it's about 2 hours. That's what the latest report by the International Water Management Institute, Sri Lanka se wo aayi hai. I don't know why Pakistan doesn't have it, but anyways, they've made it. They're saying an average woman was doing about 2 hours walking to collect water, and she was doing this multiple times a day. And then she's bringing this water in troughs on her head. When you speak to these women, and I spoke to some of these women a few years ago, they said our hair fall, our head hurts, our back hurts, our legs hurt. We walk in non-clement weather, whether it's raining, it's sunny, it's hail, whatever it is. We have to do this because our kids need the water, our food has to be cooked, whatever. When they're making this journey, they're exposed to threats by wild animals, they're exposed to sexual harassment, sexual violence, alongside just the emotional and physical turmoil of it. Now in comes a flood, right? In comes a climate shock, or in comes even a drought. And suddenly your water infrastructure is shaken. That well that you were accessing before, or that pump, is no longer accessible. Or a drought comes and that water source or the water table is disturbed. And so now this woman is going to, per the latest report, be walking about 5 hours. And so her work burden or her time burden has increased by about 100 to 150%. This leaves her with less time to actually engage in employed work, or to learn something, or learn a skill, acquire a skill, or to even educate herself. So this is one side of it, but it sort of segues nicely into the livelihood aspect of things, which I feel is actually pretty much the backbone of things. So with climate change on a daily basis, like on a slow set climate change, it's affecting your agriculture, it's affecting your livestock, and it's affecting your fisheries. The three main primary sources of income for women. I don't want to go into too much detail on how this is happening. I think everybody has a sense of it. But these sources of income are the primary sources of income for women. A lot of these women don't own land. They don't own formal title to land. So this is informal labor for them, but this was also an informal means of income. When they are no longer, so on a daily basis, let's say like this year, for example, climate change has affected the growth period. There's less income that's coming in for the woman. When there's a climate shock like a flood, that income is completely disturbed. And it's not just from agriculture, it's also from livestock. That's been like the 2022 floods. Apparently 1.1 million livestock died in that process. Now most of that was a direct source of income for women. And when we talk about women being agriculturalists or women working on the fields, they are pretty much working as farmers alongside men. It's just that they don't own the land, so they're not tilling it. But I feel like the biggest shock that women experience from climate change is actually the loss of personal income. When they have lost their personal income, whether it's by not accessing fields anymore, by not having livestock to rear, by not being able to sell eggs or milk or whatever, or fisheries, because fisheries are also affected by climate change. When seawater level either rises or when seawater becomes hotter, fish breed less, closer to the coast. They move inward into water. Anyways, so when this source of income decreases for women, what starts happening is there is a multifaceted effect that flows from it. These women suddenly lose their security at home. When they lose their security at home, there are many studies that now suggest that domestic violence is linked to climate change. The hotter it gets or the less the household income is, men are abusing women more. Whereas women who had some form of income perhaps could have stood up for themselves, now with a decrease in their own financial security, they are succumbing more to domestic violence. Similarly, when household burden increases, what women end up doing is they start marrying their daughters off at a much younger age. When the 2022 floods came, there was a lot of talk about flood brides. That's the term that was coined. So what was happening was that younger girls were, a lot of them underage, were being married off to men who were financially stable, mostly in bigger cities. And the idea was that women would get, that households would get some form of money in return, and also they would shed one mouth to feed. So there's like they're shedding their financial burden in this process. Another aspect that flowed from these floods that have surfaced were deep-rooted evils in our society that are sort of becoming more manifest because of climate change, is one of dowries. So when the families want to wed off their daughters, and men have the boys' side has an upper hand on this, because so what they're doing is they're saying, we will only get married if you give us a motorbike, or if you give us 2 cows, or if you give us 5 hens and 2 sheep. And in this process, the girl's family is actually incurring a greater financial burden of financial debt. And another thing that is flowing, and again culturally, is that when household income is decreasing and there are children studying, the family will pull out the daughter from school. Not the son, the daughter. She is the first to be pulled out of school. One part is because they want her to work, another part is because they want her to assist the mother in their domestic chores. So that is one sort of influx of impacts that are caused by climate change or a climate shock. On the other hand, maternal and pregnant women are severely affected by climate shocks like floods. When the 2022 floods came, there were 650,000 pregnant women in that region. Most of them ended up being malnourished. There was a lot of premature birth. Camps were being set up, and we will come to it. I think most panelists will talk about it. It's just that these camps are never designed for women. And there was a lot of information that flowed on how these women were just not safe in these camps. So there was not enough parda for them to actually deliver safely or give safe birth. Alongside that, one last thing which I'll touch upon, and there are multiple effects of climate change, either on a slow onset basis or through a climate shock. But the last one I'll talk about is that of how more women than men end up dying in climate shocks like floods. Now, the study that is quoted is actually a fairly old one. In about 2002, cyclones hit Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, having a similar socio-economic sort of structure as Pakistan, is often relied upon in climate jurisprudence. When these cyclones hit Bangladesh, a lot of women refused to be rescued by men. They said their clothes are wet, they don't want to be rescued by na-mehrams, they'd rather sort of die than have somebody they're not married to or who's not a mehram rescue them. And a lot more women ended up dying. Then some studies were conducted. One of them was, of course, the issue of religion and cultural landscapes. The other was that more boys end up at a younger age learning how to swim and climb trees. Girls just don't have that kind of access, right? So when floods come or when cyclones come, boys or men have acquired an ability to to save themselves, either by swimming or by clutching something. Women, unfortunately, just have not. So the UN estimates that about 14 times more women than men end up dying when floods hit, especially in socioeconomic cultures like ours. And I can go on, but I think I've laid the landscape fairly thoroughly.
All right, great. Thank you, Sara. You've explained how women experience climate differently than men, but now I'm going to sort of transition to Fazilda and ask her about implementation. Fazilda, so on paper, it seems Pakistan has fairly kind of robust policies. And then Sarah mentioned how women suffer income shocks a little differently, but we still have institutions like BISP that perhaps can be kind of leveraged to buffer those shocks. So where do you think, and I'm actually borrowing this question from one of our young policy scholars here in the room who asked this great question in one of these sessions yesterday. So where do you think this, the gaps emerge between policy and implementation on the ground, particularly at the more sort of disaggregated provincial and district levels?
Thank you, Savil. Thank you for having me. And so I'd say it's not just an implementation gap. It's a design gap as well, and I'll just come to why. So first up, like you said, we don't have. So we're doing very well on paper, right? We have, a number of our colleagues, use that famous phrase that Pakistan is a graveyard of policies. So we have policies, we have frameworks, and some work that I did for the Water and Environment Conference a couple of years ago. There was some work on climate justice. So we were looking at how gender justice and climate justice shows up in Pakistan's climate and water policy documents, right? So some of the work that we did actually goes to show that the word, even if the word justice doesn't appear, there is, especially in the more recent documents, there's definitely that acknowledgement of people of vulnerable groups, including women. Often the language goes vulnerable groups, including women and children with disabilities and older populations. But if we go way back, so starting from 1992, the National Conservation Strategy. There has been acknowledgement of gender from the very beginning, right? So the National Conservation Strategy, the National Climate Change Policy, both the original one and the updated 2021 one. Then the framework for the implementation of climate change policy, which runs all the way up to 2030. Pakistan's nationally determined contributions, 2016, 2021, the updated NDCs 2.3.0, the ones that were released, the one that was released, document released last year. Then there's there are policy documents, again, donor funded, and in this case, GCF funded, the Green Climate Fund, Readiness Grant funded. There's a climate change gender action plan, right? Where very dedicated documents that you see existing as frameworks to sort of guide the gender sensitive adaptation and mitigation. There's the National Adaptation Plan, again, has gender as one of its overarching guiding principles and frameworks, gender sensitive adaptation as one of its, and then the most recent, the National DRR strategy, the disaster risk reduction strategy. So all of these documents at the federal level mention gender. The language is very precise. If we come from the federal level to the provincial level, the language is even, it's for instance, Sindh climate change policy document, and then I think Sindh has another parallel one. It's called the Gender Equality and Women Empowerment, the GEWE, that they came out with recently, right? It's very precise language as to where that, how gender is a key overarching principle, how vulnerable groups need to be need to be included. So there's inclusion there. There's specific targeting, not just in these special gender-oriented frameworks and documents, but also to quite an extent in the provincial climate change policies, the Punjab climate change policy, the most recent one, the Balochistan climate change policy, and the Sindh one as well. So there is throughout the federal and provincial documents, you will see very precise drafting, very precise vocabulary. The vocabulary is not missing. When it comes to gender and acknowledging that gender is any development, sustainable development, and any DRR needs to be gender sensitive and women focused. The gap, even before we come to implementation, is definitely in the design, right? So and that's where we come to the institutional bit. Many a times we see that, so gender does get a room of its own, but it doesn't get a seat at the table where budgets are being allocated, where decisions are being made, right? So yes, gender will get a room in NDMA way back, shayad maybe about 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They had a gender and child cell, right? But we all know how well integrated gender is as far as DRR is concerned in practice. So gender gets a room of its own, somewhere maybe at the periphery of that house or down the hall, but not really a seat at the table where decisions are being made. So that's one. When we come to implementation, I'll give you another example. I was looking at the Punjab Disaster Management Commission, right? So under PDMA, one of the ways that DRR gets coordinated, implemented is the Provincial Disaster Management Commissions. And this is before, this was after devolution. We'll come to devolution in a bit as well, because that introduces another layer. The Disaster Management Commission does not have the Women Development Department as one of its members. It will have the Revenue Minister, the Law Minister. It will have 4 NGO representatives or civil society representatives. It will have CM Punjab. It has all of those stakeholders, but nobody from, so Chairman PND. It will have all of those stakeholders, but nobody from the Women Development Department, right, at the provincial level. Again, a lot of this, the complications and have also been introduced by devolution post 2010. We saw DRR DRR was devolved to the provincial and the district level. We saw, water, we saw climate, all of them, experience similar pathways of devolution where authority was devolved, but the responsibility was devolved, but then the responsibility and authority, but then the capacity didn't really catch up, right? And that's what we see at the district level as well. For those of us who experienced the 2022 floods were massive in their scale, biblical, and but they were in a sense, at least for most of us in this room, they were in a sense out there, right? Still out there. I feel that the 2025 floods were very close to home, right? So you had your major secondary cities experiencing massive urban flooding. You had district government step in for the first time, and those DRR documents, the adaptation plans, we have the national adaptation plan, and then we've experimented with some district adaptation plans as well. And as we speak, there are consultations, they're being rolled out. Some of them are women focused. And it's an exercise that's largely uneven, right? They'll handpick a few vulnerable districts and then they'll roll them out. And the district adaptation plan very nicely, sits mostly on that the DC office or the commissioner's desk. But districts do not have the capacity, right? So summing up, there is a design problem where gender is not given a central seat at the table, where decisions are being made, where budgets are allocated, where it's even visible, right? We all know that post 2022 floods, in the post disaster needs assessment report, the international donors and the government had a really hard time collecting gender disaggregated data, and that constraint remains even now. So gender disaggregated data, so starting from that decision making, how those, the information on which those decisions rest, the power to make those decisions, and then the representation in the right room, getting a seat at the table is very important, along with that implementation, that capacity issue. So.
All right. Thank you, Fazil. Well, I guess naturally this leads us to think like who gets a seat at the table when these decisions are made. So Zainab, women, especially in rural areas, play a central role in managing water and also absorbing shocks or climate shocks. Yet it seems they remain underrepresented in decision-making bodies. So how does this sort of imbalance affect climate and water policy?
Thank you very much, CDPR. Thank you, Samuel, for having me. I would take Fazilda's point first forward, that this is not just about implementation. First of all, it's about the policy design. I think the major problem with our policy making approach is that we try to take big examples, we try to follow big examples, and we just keep on writing excellent documents by writing that we are going to adapt this plan, we are going to adapt this model, we are going to achieve this target, and we come up with the huge targets which do not match the ground realities. The ground realities are very different. So the first challenge of policy making, I think, the policy design is that are you aware of that ground reality for which you're making the policy? Are you aware of those political, economic, cultural realities, that environment in which you're going to apply the policy? So as Sarah just mentioned that in 2002, a lot of women in Bangladesh lost their lives because they were not ready to be rescued by the men. So, and disasters, cyclones in Bangladesh, floods in Pakistan, droughts in Pakistan, they are not a new thing. So had our policy, any policy document, had it ever mentioned or it ever incorporated that we need to raise a force of women who can rescue women in such circumstances. So that's something you do not need to actually invest a lot of resources in that. Within the existing institutions, you are raising a force and you're also trying to give the employment to the women. Secondly, we will achieve this target, but the question remains how? What is your economic condition? So the first thing is the policy design, in which we often ignore these realities. Second important thing is that when we talk about women, as both of my colleagues, they very rightly pointed out that there is also a lot of problem with the culture, but a lot of problem with the data. disaggregated data. But I think we have that data also through Benazir Income Support Program, through such programs. And why are all political parties, why is government so serious about these programs? Because they keep their constituencies intact. So there is some realization which needs to be made that climate is something that is so closely associated with women, and women are very important part of your constituencies. Only then I think this sensitization only can bring some focus on women, and that can bring some attention that how to actually put focus on gender in these communities. Another important reality is that when we talk about climate policy, when we talk about water policy, we ignore, and that's at the national level, that we ignore the role of communities. That at the end of the day, it's the communities who have to deal with this. And we have to empower communities. And when we are going to think about communities only, then we can put actually targeted focus on women. That in communities, within communities, they have to remain within communities, and they have to be taken care of by the communities. I think that's something, if we incorporate in our policies, that can give some space to women also, and that can give some space to women, and they can feel comfortable that someone else from outside is not coming to rescue us. It's our own people, and we have to take the lead, and we need to take important decisions. Fourth important thing is that, as you mentioned, that why on the decision making tables still we are unable to bring the women. The most important thing in it is the ignorance of the fact that communities should be given importance, and communities should be brought at the forefront while making the policy, not just at the implementation, that you give some resources to the communities and you just tell them do this or move to that place or provide some first aid to your people. No, that's not the case. And other important thing is that a very important way of giving space to women in climate debate, in climate policy, in climate decision making is by devolution of power. And when we talk about devolution of power, our performance is worse. So without the grassroots governance, and it's, let's be very candid about this, that it's not about giving us three women space. None of us has been affected by floods in our lives. It's about giving space to a woman who lost something meaningful in her life due to floods. Probably her source of income, probably her family members, probably her house. So it's very important to listen to her voice. And you cannot just go to Rajanpur and bring an affected woman to Lahore to make the policy. You need to move to Rajanpur. You need to go to interior Sindh, to the places, to Sakhar, to Jamshoro, their villages. You need to sit with them and ask their problems and then translate them into policies. Only then that implementation will have impact also. And for that's only doable through grassroots governance, not just by giving representation to women at the highest level of policy making. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, in managing climate, in adapting climate resilient models.
All right, great. Thank you, Zainab. So, we've kind of got a scale of the problem, and now let's look ahead. So, Sara, recommend 2 or 3 practical reforms that would make Pakistan's climate response or climate policy more gender responsive. And, what shape will they take? How would they work?
I wrote down a list of at least 12 in my mind.
All right, focus on one or two key ones.
All right, so I think the most important is a mindset shift. Firstly, women are not victims. They should be considered as the first line, especially with climate adaptation. It's very important. We should, in fact, our narrative should also be switching away from vulnerable to, I don't know, we need to come up with a better term for this, but, like the defenders. They should be defenders. The second one, I think Zainab has touched upon very nicely. It is that policies fail because they are not drafted from a grassroots level up. There's not a bottom-up approach. And also they fail because there's not enough awareness generated about them. So awareness generation should be a mandatory step for all laws, all policies, all documents, anything that is coming out of any federal or provincial body. And then I think what's important is title or land ownership for women. That is something that's important not just as a source of security for women, but also because they can pledge it as collateral for loans in the aftermath of floods or when the rehabilitation stages begin. The Supreme Court has in July passed a judgment saying that women, and by virtue of being women under the Sharia and under our law, are entitled to their share of their property, and this covers agricultural land as well. So if these women have brothers or husbands saying they're not entitled to them, they are. It's just like a birthright now, and the Supreme Court has recognized it. The problem is, how many of us knew about this, right? I mean, we didn't know enough about it. So the women in rural areas definitely don't know enough about it. Then disaggregated data. You need data for a variety of things, but with women or marginalized groups, age, gender, formal title, land title ownership, this data you definitely need, because then you don't lose out on the bigger picture when you're drafting policies or coming up with solutions. But to answer Sawal's question when he's saying, give me practical examples. Okay, so practical examples. I did some work with the UN body once, and we said, okay, let's give one goat to a woman in Sajawal district in Sindh. The next morning, those women had sold those goats. They said, oh, we got a free goat, we got 5,000 rupees per goat, oh, excellent, our month is covered. No. So that is where the government and that is where international agencies are going wrong. Because you're not starting from a bottom-up approach. You have to create the awareness, you have to give some kind of education, and then you have to work your way up. In the aftermath of these floods, 2022, Dadu and Khairpur were completely submerged, and women who were going who used to previously go for seasonal migration. So climate change causes a lot of seasonal migration. They go to different districts and earn enough for the whole year, basically. They couldn't indulge in seasonal migration. So what UN bodies again were doing was they were giving something called climate grants. They were giving like a bit of money to a woman, so she could have her own. She could have some money to rely on. But in my opinion, I don't think that was the right solution. The right solution was giving her a portable poultry coop, like a jali जिसमें उसकी chicken उसके बच सकती है सैलाब में. So she still has access to some eggs which she can sell. The right decision would have been to help her with now something that's become common in flood-prone areas is mushroom growth. So what these women do is they're encouraged to grow mushrooms in bags. Literally, घर में लफाफों में mushrooms grow करते हैं, but they sell for a very good price. But women don't have access to this. What women need, so women generally in rural areas, by the way, are gatekeepers of seeds. They germinate them, they guard them, they look after the communal seed bank. So what you need to give women something that will keep their seed safe and dry. So what you're doing is you're literally encouraging women to make something out of nothing. Those are practical solutions. When it comes to floods, and I'm sure these guys will talk about it, but flood or disaster relief policies, in our 2022 flood, something that was completely shocking was when aid was coming. And yes, I am cognizant of the fact that there is complete pandemonium at that point. Nobody can really control something so large, so colossal. But when trucks were coming, they were throwing food from trucks. Women cannot fight men to get those, they just cannot. There has to be a different method of distribution for women. Most of the relief goods did not include women menstrual products. Again, you need a woman drafting these policies so that you're thinking about these things. Same with maternity issues, same with labor. There was just not enough things. By the way, if there is time, and maybe in the question and answer session, some things are being done now. So there is some good news. So yeah, I mean, I can talk more if.
Yeah, we can maybe turn back to the remaining list perhaps in the question and answer session. All right, Fazilda, really curious about BISP and perhaps similar programs. Now, one can use these in some. I would think you leverage BISP to deliver support in moments of crises. But what are the biggest barriers right now which prevents women from receiving support through these particular programs? And how do we overcome those?
So I think before going into barriers, maybe I'd like to introduce this term called voluntary immobility, right? So voluntary mobility is essentially a person experiences voluntary immobility when they have the resources and the means, let's say post floods or post disaster, they have the resources and the means to move to a safe place, safe place, and I'll come to why. But they choose to stay put. Now with how did that happen? Now with what happens in Pakistan's social and cultural context, and I'll connect it to what you said about gender-based violence. I did a bit of work with the UN Women on their 2022, post-2022 GBV surveys. So surveys around, how rehabilitation and, what the condition was in some of these relief camps, right? So I'll connect it to gender-based violence and harassment, and we've all read stories of post-2022 floods. Now the alternative to leaving, many of these women choose to be, along with the elderly, choose to be voluntary immobile in their homes, because the alternative to going away or seeking safety in a relief camp is going to a relief camp that's literally set up on higher ground on a pakka road, right? And there, most of the elders of the house, they are very entrenched in the idea that this is safer for our women than setting up on the road. Now connect this voluntary immobility, and this is where I want to make that connection with BISP as well. Connect this voluntary immobility with the need for relief to reach you in a space where it can't reach you, right? So BISP, I'm very, very hopeful about, and there's some great feedback. There's a lot of impact assessments that it has improved women's agency, 2-year, 5-year studies. It has definitely improved women's agency. There are stories of empowerment, there's stories of cash grants, some bolted on by donors such as UN Women, targeting women. So it's a proven program. Now where CNICs were an enabler for BISP, they were also a disabler when disaster actually struck. And classic textbook hum padhte hain na, the 4 C's of disaster. I forget, it's communication, coordination, and then 2 other C's. But those, everything breaks down in a disaster, including the ability of women to reach, the point of access, or Nadra centers get flooded, right? So while CNICs were enablers, they were also disablers, because their identities would get, their ID cards would get washed away, their documents would get washed away, their ability to go to a Nadra center is compromised in, in a space where, in a situation like the 2022 floods, or even in the last year, 2025 areas that got flooded, the water took, I remember we were doing some work with the Sialkot government, the water took about 3 weeks to recede, for us to be able to go back to the field. And 2022 floods, we all know it took about, again, 6 months. So there's definitely, that we know that these programs have worked well. We know it works. We have great evidence, on it. It's just the last mile that's the problem. And then what do you do when disaster strikes, and all coordination, communication, and all of the other C's, they kind of break down, right? Do you require then, document, how do you access the most vulnerable, or how do you make the most vulnerable access funds at a time when they need it the most? So yeah, that bit.
All right, awesome. Right, so let's return to institutions and how they shape decisions. So finally, Zainab, before we turn to questions from the audience and last few words from you, what are some of the institutional reforms that would perhaps give women a greater voice in water governance or climate policy? I know at some point you had mentioned quotas. Is that a way to kind of like achieve this? And how do we improve this representation in governance?
I think, first of all, at the highest level, we need to understand that Pakistan has one way forward only in the face of climate change risks, and that's climate change, climate resilience, adaptation measures. And we cannot go, being such a hard-hit developing economy, we cannot go for climate mitigation. So first of all, we need to understand that climate change adaptation measures, that's our way forward. So that's something that when we make this decision, that will change the institutional approach towards climate policies implementation. Second important decision which needs to be taken is that without the involvement of grassroots level, without the involvement of communities, we cannot go for these adaptation measures. And when we talk about communities, that naturally puts focus on women, because as we have been talking, and that's pretty much clear globally now, that women are the first line of victims and both of defenders also. So that capacity building at the level of communities for adaptation must initiate with women, the women who deal with water, the women who provide water for their children, who are responsible for the cleanliness of their homes, of their children, who cook, who work in farms. And it's very important to make them understand that something or somewhere where you are using a gallon of water, perhaps that thing can be done with half a liter of water. This approach can bring a huge change. And certainly here comes when this focus will shift to communities, and within communities on women, and at grassroots level when they are involved in some governance framework, institutional frameworks, that will lead to this understanding that women need to be given some quotas, water quotas. That's very important. That you need to fix that quota for women, that a woman's household is also very important. Her personal hygiene connected with water is also very important. As much important as a field is, as much important as a tree is, as much important as climate conservation strategy is. So only then we can move forward. And it's also about making them direct stakeholders in the system, in the structure, and in the climate adaptation measures. And it's like giving them ownership that this is your share within this structure, natural structure, and you need to protect it. So I think that's going to change, that's going to steer a big change in the system, in the implementation, and in the institutional approach. But certainly that's cyclic, according to my understanding, that has to come from top and then from bottom to top again.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Zainab. So, so 3 takeaways here. So, 1, climate impacts are unequal. 2, it seems institutional design is just as important as policy on paper, if not more important. And 3, women need to be more active participants in decision making, in climate decision making, beyond just being beneficiaries of climate relief. And with that, I turn to the audience for their questions.
آپ کولیگس کی جو جتنی بھی ڈسکشن سنی ہے اس میں مطلب اتنا ٹائم تو نہیں ہے میں زیادہ بات کر سکوں. تو بیسک چیز ہے کہ ایک تو کمیونیکیشن. سپوز ہمیں کوئی پالیسی بنا دے گورنمنٹ اور یہ کمیونیکیٹ کریں کہ گوٹ نہ بیچے وہ، یا بے نظیر انکم اسکیم یا کوئی اور سپورٹ دے تو اس کا پازیٹیو استعمال کر سکے. تو میرے اور اس کے درمیان کمیونیکیشن کا اتنا بڑا گیپ ہے، میں اس کی زبان نہیں سمجھتا، وہ میری زبان نہیں سمجھتی. آپ یہ مطلب اتنا بڑا گیپ ہے، یہ خلیج ہے بہت بڑی. تو ہم اس سچویشن میں تو ایسے لگتا ہے کہ ہمیں کوئی خاص گرپ اس پہ نہیں ہے، لیکن ہم بھی شاید یہ فرض پورا کر رہے ہیں کہ ڈسکشن کر لیں اور ایک دوسرے کو اس طرح سیٹسفائی کر دیں کہ ہم نے بہت بڑا کام کر لیا ہے. حالانکہ یہ بھی بڑا جاب ہے اس وقت کی سوسائٹی میں ایسے کرنا، کیونکہ وہ اس کو بھی مائنڈ کرتے ہیں کہ ان ایشو کو نہ چھیڑیں، ہم جو کچھ کر رہے ہیں ٹھیک کرتے ہیں. نمبر 2 ایجوکیشن. اگر ایجوکیشن صرف ایک ایجوکیشن اگر نہیں ہوگی تو کوئی بھی سوسائٹی ڈیولپ کر ہی نہیں سکتی. مجھے یہ اس وقت یاد آیا جب آپ نے راجن پور کا نام لیا. راجن پور میں 5 to 15 ایئرس کے بچے 40% سے زیادہ آؤٹ آف اسکول ہیں. 7% یہی بچے لاہور میں آؤٹ آف اسکول ہیں. یہ وہ بیس ہے جو فیوچر کسی بھی ملک کا بنائے گی اگر وہ واقعی انڈیپینڈنٹ ملک ہے، اپنی پالیسیاں خود بناتا ہے. تو یہ وہ بیسک چیزیں ہیں، اگر ہم ان کو سامنے رکھتے ہوئے اپنی ڈسکشن میں ان چیزوں کو شامل کریں تو میرا خیال ہم پازیٹیولی آگے موو کر سکتے ہیں. تھینک یو.
Any of you guys want to respond to Raj Asad?
جی بہت شکریہ. میں جو آپ نے یہ بات کی نا کہ ایک لینگویج بیریئر ہے یا ہماری زبان انہیں نہیں سمجھ آتی یا انہیں ہماری نہیں سمجھ آتی، یہ ایک بہت اچھا دس از اے گڈ پوائنٹ جو آپ نے چھیڑا. اس میں اب ایک اس بات کو جب ڈیزاسٹر ریلیف پالیسیز تیار ہو رہی تھی تو تب بھی بہت ہم نے مطلب میں نے بھی اس پہ بہت زور ڈالا تھا فار دا گورنمنٹ. تو اس کا ایک حل نکلا تھا تب، اور وہ حل یہ تھا کہ موبائل سروس کے تھرو اس زبان میں پیغام پہنچایا جائے جو اس جگہ یا اس علاقے کی زبان ہے. اور پوٹوہار میں اب ایک NGO ہے جو پوٹوہاری میں ہی عورتوں کو خاص طور پہ ٹارگٹ کرتی ہے ارلی وارننگ سسٹمز میں، اور یہی پلان تھا کہ باقی بھی ملک میں उनकी ज़ुबान में वही वर्नैक्युलर में या मोबाइल फ़ोन के ज़रिए या ऐलान के ज़रिए, मस्जिदों में ऐलान के ज़रिए औरतों तक पहुंचाया जाए. तो ये बिल्कुल आपका एक अच्छा पॉइंट था जी.
थैंक यू सो मच फॉर योर क्वेश्चन. मैं आपने जो दूसरा सवाल किया एजुकेशन का, उस पर थोड़ा सा मे बी माई कॉमेंट इज़ नॉट directly answering your question, but जहाँ एजुकेशन बहुत ज़रूरी है वहाँ क्लाइमेट एजुकेशन भी बहुत ज़रूरी है, क्लाइमेट लिटरेसी भी बहुत ज़रूरी है. हमारे यहाँ अगेन एक कोऑर्डिनेशन प्रॉब्लम आता है. Our curriculum does not have climate literacy as a part of the official government curriculum. There is climate literacy and environment being taught at private schools, here and there, of course not uniform. But in terms of public schools, there has been a lot of effort. This gentleman who was, I think, AC South Punjab, I forget whether he was AC Multan or forget the designation. He did a lot of work. For about 2 years, he went around with a curriculum for secondary schools and tried to introduce, climate education through stories. By the end of those 2 years, और उनकी हमने बड़ी meetings भी set कराई, MOCC से भी set हुई, फिर parliamentarian से भी set हुई, ठीक है. By the end of those 2 years, what he managed to do was introduce that text as a reference text in the Punjab textbook situation. So again, आप ये कह रहे थे ना कि हम यहाँ बैठ के एक डिस्कशन करें. There are people who are doing a lot of whose lives, so like 2 years plus of work gone into an initiative for climate literacy, for climate education, but nothing really coming out of it.
All right, great. Thanks, Fazilda. Before I turn to sort of, I guess, the mature audience, I'll turn to some of the young policy scholars and see, if they have any questions. There's some young policy scholars in the back who I just want to see if they'd like to, you're asking great questions yesterday morning, so it was a sort of a lecture. They're going through this 2-week intensive research policy program. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to kind of think about your questions and I'll turn back to you. Before I get to you, he had his hand up. Yeah.
I remember 2010 disaster in southern Punjab where Indus water was flooded, and regulating authorities, I was also witness there. The people asked them to evacuate this place because flood is coming, water is coming, there is a dangerous place. People don't understand. Say, no, River Sindh is our father like. He never disturbed last 500 years. So people don't just like the authorities' statements. Whereas in the United States, when regulatory authority asks them, there is a cyclone, there is a flood, certainly people evacuate. And this is one of the things, the women's problem comes when the properly not evacuated by their families. This is one. Second thing, this was discussed that when you go to Google's, you find 58% literacy rates. So we need to have 98% literacy rate. People must be awareness about it. And second thing, very important, you're talking very difficult topics. Women don't like to evacuate by the men in this society. There is a reason. Something like maybe religious reason, maybe some mindset reason, maybe some trustful environment. There is no trustworthy environment. So how we can make these gaps between these problems to policy making? One thing I would like to tell you, women are coming ahead. In bureaucracy training, 60% women are getting training for administration job, and 40%, if similarly you go to universities, you will find 80% women, girls are higher education. So women are coming up. So we need to have a think about that. But certainly administration jobs will come out. Over 60% bureaucracy they will look for the women's rights like that.
All right.
So we have good thing like
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's collect a bunch of questions and then I'll turn to you.
Okay, so I'm currently working at the Lahore School of Economics. I'm doing my PhD economics, and I'm also a teacher. So I think that my voice without the mic is louder. But I have some problems. Okay, so when we talk about policy at my institution, we focus on the availability of data. So I'm working at the intersection of social norms, how social norms amplify the effect of climate change on women's economic outcomes. So now the problem that I'm facing is that we don't have any certain measure or index regarding the social norms. We do have a lot of variables such as violence and land ownership and all of that, but nothing we know that can actually measure the norms beyond these variables. And the norms are not only existing in the rural areas, they're also existing in the urban areas. So I think this is understudied, the social norms one, and I am not connected with any international organization, so I don't know what kind of data is there that's not publicly available. Secondly, I would like to mention that the importance of indigenous information, that these people from those certain areas know that what kind of things are indicating that there is a flood coming or it's going to be climatically chaotic. So I think there's a missing piece there. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Yeah, all right, young folks, question? Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're doing well. I just had a quick question. As I'm part of the younger generation, I often hear that climate change is like the next really big problem for us, something that we're gonna have like a major crisis in the future. So as students who are in their peak high school years, what can we do, especially in rural areas for women who face these crises? Like often I hear to, giving donations. However, as you mentioned, money isn't everything. There should be proper structured solutions. So what do you recommend?
Great, thanks. Let's answer these three and then we'll take a final round. Okay, so there's Engineer Saab's question, hers on indigenous knowledge, and then the ones on what should the youth do. Yeah, why don't you begin? Yeah.
About Engineer Saab's question, I agree with you totally that we do not have the respect for institutions, which, if we broadly try to understand, is something, a rebellious kind of attitude towards state. And that tells a lot about the relationship of state and society, the state and citizens. That's the trust deficit. So it will continue until we transform or reform our institutions. So we have seen our public servants, our same bureaucracy working very hard in disasters, the same bureaucracy we are criticizing every day. But when they are delivering at their best, even then they do not get the respect they deserve. And that's certainly because of that state-citizen relationship. We do not trust our state, we do not trust the institutions. The second thing is that we have that national behavior, and that's quite common, that unless we see that disaster coming or anything right in front of our eyes, until then we do not take it seriously. And the third certainly is problem with the gentleman was talking about from HRCP, he was talking about education. I would add one other thing is that even our educated people are unfortunately not very aware. So it's more about awareness, it's more about the attitudes which can be changed only with proper kind of training, social trainings. That certainly educational institutions play that primary role in training the behavior of citizens, but that and civic education comes from educational institutions, but there is also a behavior of a community. So I think that with the breaking of that community bond, that behavior has also worsened. So this is something that we need to reconsider when we talk about the policies. We always think about, like, let me share a small thing with you. This morning I was evaluating some policy presentations and policy papers at Civil Services Academy. And there were 3 presentations on water security, water governance. And at the end of every of those presentations, there were huge recommendations, big ones. Someone applied Singapore model, one applied Icelandic model, and I just asked that gentleman and that lady that you are not going to market, you are standing in the market, you are in the job market, you are in the position to make the policy and implement the policy. हम तो बैठ के बात करते हैं ना पॉलिसी मेकिंग सर्कल्स, तो वो तो हैं. आपने आइसलैंड का मॉडल उठा के लगा दिए. व्हाट्स द पर कैपिटा इनकम ऑफ आइसलैंड, क्लाइमेट रियलिटी. तो जब आप इस पैटर्न पे एजुकेशन भी दे रहे हैं, दे आर हाईली एजुकेटेड, उनमें तो कोई भी अनएजुकेटेड नहीं है. मेरा जैसा तो कोई नहीं है ना, सारे हाईली एजुकेटेड हैं बहुत ज्यादा. तो अगर इस पैटर्न पे एजुकेशन जा रही है तो आई थिंक द ट्रेंड ऑफ एजुकेशन also needs to be reconsidered.
All right, great. Thanks, Zainab. Sana, you want to take her question on indigenous knowledge, and then Fazilda, you can probably kind of give advice to what is it that the high schoolers can do.
So, great question, and I'm sure your work sounds very interesting. Definitely, I think we hit a roadblock with data, and I don't know if you wanted to ask about the indigenous knowledge or the data part, but I can comment more on the data. So in my work also, I find that access to data is very tough. But I was once sitting on a panel with somebody fairly senior, and he was adamant that data exists. He was in the government, adamant, completely, like fighting with me. The data exists. And the problem is that ministries don't want to share it. So then I encountered, when I was working on the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions for 2021, I discovered that data exists even at a local body level, except that when you ask the people involved, and you ask them, like when you're sitting in Islamabad and you send them an email or give them a call saying, oh, can you let me know XYZ, they don't know how to extract it, extrapolate it, and how to send it forward. So they have it in files, they have it in their storage, they have it in their computers if they have a computer. It's just that accessing it for us is tough. And then alternatively, there is I also experienced that there is a problem in our mindsets, in government bodies, where they want to keep delegating work, right? So if you ask the water ministry for some data, they'll be like, nahi, aap climate change ministry se lein. If you ask the climate change ministry, they'll be like, planning commission se aap lein. So basically, they will keep moving you forward and you're shuffling around. But I mean, the secret is that there is some data out there. Yes.
Thank you for your question. It's actually something that I have a lot to say about. I think, especially
As a young high schooler,
no, as someone who's a voter, who's at the stage where many of youth, young folks are, and I see a lot of young people. Every young person starting an Instagram page, starting an NGO, which is great initiative. But think about your relationship with nature. You know, this is something that I start off with when I teach my students. I always ask them to close their eyes and imagine what nature means to them. You know, think of nature, you close your eyes and imagine. And many a times, you know, it's often that image of that very pristine, mountains, lake, lush forests, right, that we regard as nature. So nature is always something out there, not in my backyard, not the tree or the overflowing dustbin in your school, not the plastic wrapper that you threw outside. Nature is always something pristine and out there, right? We often never think of the environment around us as natural where impact and use. So I say start small. Again, might sound cliche. When I'm shopping, especially from the local store, I always say I don't want policy. I don't want plastic. Start small. Start with your own school. Could you make your school completely circular? There are examples of some UN branded schools like that in India. Right? Can you make your school a circular school? Can you make your school a zero plastic based school? Right? And there are many ways to do that and to take initiative. So start small and do it because you care, not just because it will look good on your college application.
That's good advice. Yeah. Okay. Last very quick round of questions. Keep it short. And I also request the panelists, when you answer those questions, just very brief responses, and then I'll turn to Ijasa for some parting words. So, yeah.
Hi, so you mentioned that even, educated people, they lack awareness, and I agree with you. So my question to you is, how can we raise awareness on climate issues, not only in our own circles, but also in other communities, keeping in mind the fact that, we need to incorporate their own dialects and, again, there's also the issue of the government raising awareness because there's like a lack of legitimacy with the citizens.
Yo.
Basically, my question is to Sarah. You raised this recommendation when you said that we should raise awareness that women also have property rights, or there's this new law which has passed. Since you have a law background, don't you think even if these women know that we have this birthright, so how are we going to push them? How are they going to have access to these rights? Won't their brothers or fathers or husbands stop them from them? So how practical is this recommendation?
Okay, quick responses. One question is just directed at you, Sarah, but yeah.
I think raising awareness today is much easier, and that's social media, technology. I think that's the easiest way to start with. And Pakistan is among the countries with a lot of cell phones, a lot of internet users. So it's the very much game of the social media, how to change the priorities. So I think the easiest, quickest way is to initiate with this.
Yeah, Sarah.
I'm glad you're pushing back on this because I agree. It's tough. So we have a judgment now in place, but interestingly, before that judgment came, we had a law that the government had preempted. And this law allows women to bypass bureaucratic hurdles. They bypass standing in lines, and they can approach their closest land registry and will be given priority to have land transferred to them, or to figure out how much land they own or how much they're entitled to. That is one aspect of it. So this is something we applaud the government for. I mean, they really did think this through. That the cultural part where the brothers or fathers or husbands, will they allow them? I mean, we all know.
Ijasa, final words.
It's not really final word, but okay. So, with apologies to Raja Saab, I'm going to make a point which is quite the opposite of what he made, which is that nothing much happens. We come and we talk, and nothing much happens. Now, that's us older people having become cynical. Those are the conclusions we arrive at. I'm going to make a point that the opposite of what you said is actually going to happen. In the following way, you heard BISP being mentioned on several occasions. Do you know what BISP stands for? Benazir Income Support Program. Okay. The good thing about BISP is that there's great data, and you can reach poor households through women, exactly the topic we're talking about. I happen to be on the board of BISP. So when you made the point that the BISP asset, which is the ability to identify an affected woman in a flooded area, in fact becomes a handicap because they don't have the ID, they may have lost the ID cards. I'm going to find out whether BISP has proxies that you can use for such occasions, and if not, how they can develop those proxies. So a very good takeaway from today's discussion.
All right, I think this is a good note to kind of end the session on. Thank you for being here, and look forward to seeing you at the next policy talk.